Hello and welcome to the post-draft edition of Access Vikings. I'm joined by my Minnesota Star Tribune colleague, Andrew Krammer. We're going to try and wrap up some of the, not chaos, that sounds like too negative a term, but the craziness maybe that happened today, that has happened since we did our after hours edition on Donovan Jackson, the Vikings first round pick the other night. Andrew, let's just start like very big picture. I'll toss it to you. Like, just what's your biggest takeaway from what the Vikings did in this draft?
Yeah, to me, it was, I know we waited on Friday night for them to finally pick at number 102 after trading back. But to me, this is all about how they kind of went all in and continue to go all in on this offense around J.J. McCarthy. They obviously take Donovan Jackson at number 24, a guard in the first round. We haven't seen that in nearly 40 years for the Vikings. But as Kwesi said, the importance of those positions is growing. And as they want to run the ball more, the interior offensive line obviously becomes that much more important. But then they go wide receiver in the end of the third round with Felton out of Maryland, somebody who Ryan Grigson, the assistant GM, talked about how he's a guy that they view as more than just a speed threat, but he ran a 4.37. That's the thing people are going to see. And he's a guy that was hard to bring down. He forced a ton of missed tackles as well at Maryland. So they fill a wide receiver 3, potential, a guy who could grow into that role. Kind of hole there and totally just avoid the secondary throughout this draft. They get an interior defensive lineman and Tyrion, Ingram, Dawkins in the 5th round. But otherwise, that was their most notable defensive addition in this draft. And so I think that's really what stood out to me, is that Kevin O'Connell should have gotten what he wanted. And that includes even the trade for Sam Howell at quarterback.
Right. Yeah. Offense heavy draft class here. They ended up picking 5 players. 3 of them were offense. And then they had the 2 defenders, including the late round linebacker out of Penn State. And then, the Howell edition, which was kind of an added, I guess, cherry on top to this offensive haul, is that now they have their backup quarterback situation broken down. For anyone who wasn't following super closely, I did want to walk us through how we got to each of these picks, just because, too, I think the trades, when they choose to trade, and tells us where they viewed a guy on their board and all of that stuff. So Donovan Jackson, the Ohio State guard, they stuck and picked at number 24. That was their only first round pick, their pick of the night. Next night, they were originally slated to have 97, the compensatory pick that they got for Kirk Cousins in round 3, and instead pushed back to 102 in a trade with the Texans. That got them Maryland wide receiver Felton, as we talked about, and the number 142 overall pick. This morning, they stuck and picked at number 139, which was a pick they got in from Cleveland for, what deal was that a part of, Andrew?
That was the pick swap with Zadarius Smith about, was it a year or 2 years ago, where they swapped their 6th and 5th rounders in consecutive years. And I think this was the final piece of that trade.
Right. So in round 5, they get Georgia defensive tackle Tyrion, Ingram, Dawkins. They take their number 142 pick that they got from the Texans, traded that with the Seahawks back to 172 and added 4th-year QB Sam Howell. And then from 172, they traded back again. So we had 3 trade backs today, right? Is that right? I believe so. With the Rams to 201 and 202, bringing in their final picks, Penn State linebacker Kobe King and Pitt tight end Gavin Bartholomew. So that was the haul. It was a lot of waiting around today, I would say.
Yeah, and it was all the trade backs that everybody clamored for in round 1 and saying like, oh, you're going to trade back to get more capital, and they do so. And I thought it was a deft move by Kwesi to go back from 97 to 102, jump up to number 1. It would have been 142 in that 5th round with that move, and then he ends up flipping that pick for Sam Howell. So effectively, if you boil down those 2 separate trades, they got Sam Howell for basically moving back 5 spots in the 3rd. In addition, they ended up jumping up 15 spots. I think it was later in the 6th round. So they basically got Sam Howell for nothing. And I think that was kind of one of the best, and Kevin O'Connell talked about this on NFL Network during the draft, and saying that was a good move for us to just not really have to give up any future picks, not have to give up a whole lot, and get a quarterback when we'd all been kind of waiting to see who was this other guy going to be that they bring in. And it's going to be somebody who absolutely does not threaten J.J. McCarthy in the slightest.
Yeah, and I think it's worth noting with Howell that both, I think in that appearance on NFL Network, Kevin O'Connell said, and then Kwesi Adofo-Mensah said with us that they had scouted him in 2022, which would have been their first draft. And basically they really liked him, but at that time they're like, we're not in a place to develop a franchise QB, to draft and develop anyone. So they opted not to go that route. Obviously, 2 years later, they take J.J. McCarthy. They feel a lot more stable in themselves, I think, and have been ready to develop him. But now they get Sam Howell anyway, a guy that they liked. And, I think there are going to be some people turned off by that stat line in Washington a couple seasons back. I will say Washington was not in the best situation at that point. But I think it sounds like from what we heard from both O'Connell and Kwesi Adofo-Mensah, and then Ryan Grigson too, their senior VP of player personnel, like that experience in that season at Howell's age, he's only 24, was really important to them.
Yeah, and I thought when O'Connell talked too today about how, I think he said there's a lot in Sam's game to develop, and also we need to see where he can take it within our system. Like they feel like there's some untapped potential here, not maybe as much as Sam Darnold, a number 3 overall pick back in the day, but a little bit with him. And the difference is that in that same answer, O'Connell said, we're going to give J.J. McCarthy as many reps as possible. That means Sam Howell's not going to get a ton of reps to really work on this stuff. He's going to be with the second, third teamers. This is an insurance policy. The Vikings, much like last year with Sam Darnold, they gave Sam like every rep. And so much so that when JJ went down in Cleveland in August, they're talking about how, we were just maybe thinking of starting to give JJ some more reps. Now JJ is going to be in that seat where he's going to get every rep possible. There's not going to be a ton of room for any other quarterback to truly develop with the first team offense. So I think Vikings fans can keep this in perspective, but just in case they can't, Sam Howell's not here to do anything but kind of try and earn a backup job. And with how little they invested in him, I wouldn't be shocked if it doesn't go well. They could easily just pivot and do something else or trade for somebody else come August.
For sure. Let's go ahead and talk about some of these new guys, the even younger guys, younger than Sam. Who Sam being a year younger than me, I was like, that doesn't feel like it adds up in my head, but I guess that's where we're at. But we talked a little bit about Donovan Jackson the other night. He did come in and obviously was flown out to Minnesota and talked to us in person on yesterday. Yeah. My biggest takeaway from that was the revelation about his cat, who is named Leonardo DiCaprio. But outside of the feline fun stuff that we heard, Andrew, what stood out to you in his in-person comments from what he said or what we learned about him?
Yeah, I think him just talking about why he went and moved out to tackle. And this was stuff that the Vikings talked about after they picked him, and saying that, look, we didn't view that as like a bad thing, that this guy was out of position, didn't put up the best stats necessarily, his first starts against Abdul Carter and Penn State. We view that as a good thing, that this first round talent, was able to go out there and say, look, I will sacrifice my tape evaluation for the team because this is what we need. And then they go on and obviously win the national title. So Donovan talking about why he did that, why it meant so much to the team, his coaches, obviously spending so much time at Ohio State. I think it just kind of confirmed what the Vikings were talking about. And it just shows the kind of person that they try to bring into their facility. It's not just talk. I think a lot of teams talk about culture. They talk about collaboration and wanting to bring in the right kind of guys. 3 of the Vikings' 5 draft picks this weekend were once team captains on their college programs. And that's not counting Donovan Jackson, who they're commending as an excellent kid who decided to make this switch. So to me, it was just to hear from Donovan about that, why he did that. And really, I'm sure he said to us a lot of the same things he said to the Vikings throughout this process that led to him being the 24th pick. And I think he was just the second guard drafted behind, it would have been Tyler Booker with the Cowboys in the first round. So the Vikings didn't go out on a limb, but they did something that not every team does, which is prioritizes the interior offensive line the way that they did.
I liked Donovan got into a little bit like the story of when he was asked by Ryan Day and the rest of the Ohio State coaching staff to kick out and play tackle. And he was like, I looked at him and I was like, are you serious? And when Ryan Day didn't smile, he was like, oh, he actually is. And, he took his time in making that decision, which I think is smart, just like on a base level, but also shows his maturity in the consideration of the different factors there. Like you mentioned, said he talked with obviously coaching staff, made a call to his parents. He talked with his agent that he had, and his agent was the one who kind of walked him through some of the draft perspective side of it stuff. So it was nice hearing that and how he kind of took that time with the decision. You know, I asked him, I was like, how'd you feel coming out of that first game? Like, and he said, he was like, it wasn't a great game for me. I knew what I needed to do and to learn and work on coming out of that game, and it gave me better perspective. And he was like, I came out of it knowing I wanted to watch tape and get better. And I think it's a great thing to hear from a guy like that. So successful pick with Donovan Jackson, I think we can say, and a first round spend, it seems, early on at least.
And you brought this up Thursday night, but his parents having such an impact on him. I'm sure it makes any parents out there smile listening to that, but him talking about him representing the family name and all this stuff and talking to his parents before making a switch like that. Not every college kid certainly is doing stuff like that.
No, definitely not. So then we have Ty Felton out of Maryland, the wide receiver. The big thing that stuck out for me last night is like, this is a guy that they see, it seems like they see as a immediate impact player on special teams. They want him out there returning kicks, returning punts. That was a lot of what he did at Maryland through kind of his first 3 seasons there before taking on a larger role. And we'll talk about that later, but there's another pick that I think they see as a special teams guy. And so obviously they lost Trent Sherfield and they needed to replace that special teams presence. And it seems like they found it in Felton.
Yeah, he's an interesting pick because he's somebody that was, it was polarizing the evaluation on him. There were some places that thought that this guy could be a true number 1 receiver at some point because he's 6'1". He runs a 4.37. He's not the biggest guy. He doesn't play big either. There's some contested catch numbers that aren't always great with him, but when the ball gets to his hands and he catches it, he breaks a lot of tackles. PFF had only 5 other receivers, including Tet McMillan and Luther Burden, who broke more tackles last year as wide receivers than Ty Felton did. And then actually, to your point about the special team stuff, he only returned a few kicks and only returned a few punts. It actually wasn't a ton. And Ryan Grigson, the assistant GM, brought up to us, he said we had to watch it as pro day and see him fielding these things and saying, okay, he can do this. Like, this isn't just, he did it a few times and coaches thought he couldn't do it. The Vikings saw with their own eyes in these different settings. We see a ceiling with him as a special teamer that maybe he didn't get to show in college. And he certainly didn't last year because he was Maryland's number 1 receiver. He had a program record. I think it was 96 catches. That was 4th in the FBS. He had an incredible role, a huge role for the Terrapins last year, including he was one of the team captains that we were talking about. So he was a leader for that team, both on and off the field in a big breakout season that when you come to a team with Justin Jefferson and Jordan Addison, he's not going to get those kind of numbers, obviously. So that's when the special team stuff becomes huge. And the Vikings feel like he's a guy that is going to accept that role. And when we talked to him, he seemed pretty eager to come in and do whatever he could. And Emily, I think this also kind of says something about how they feel about Jalen Naylor, how they feel about the 3rd wide receiver spot. It seems to me that they're not all gung-ho as they used to be on Jalen being that number 3. He got an opportunity last year. He'd had a hard time staying healthy his first couple years. I believe now he's entering a contract season, his final year under contract. So I think the Vikings are kind of putting him on notice with this move as well.
Yeah, at least room for competition there you would have to expect. And a guy who said very openly he wants to compete and he's going to do whatever he can to get on the field quickly and early on. Defensive tackle, Tyrion Ingram Dawkins out of Georgia. He was the first defensive pick of this draft class for the Vikings. I think we all thought it was going to come a lot sooner than it did, but another guy, I'm flipping through my 18 pages of notes, but I think the big thing, there was either Kwesi or Grigson had a line where they were like, we look for versatility in our defense, which of course is the thing we kept on saying when we were talking about safeties and cornerbacks. They ended up getting that versatility in Ingram Dawkins, who has kind of played all across the line and said he wants to play all across the defensive line. He was asked if he has a favorite spot, and he was like, no, I like playing everywhere, which he probably does have a favorite spot, but I'll give him that answer for now. But they got their versatile player. It just wasn't where we thought it was going to be.
Yeah, he's an interesting guy. He talked about the top 30 visit that he took here, which he says was his first time ever, not just in Minnesota, but the Midwest. He's a South Carolina kid who went to Georgia. He said he's never been up in the Midwest. And so he was if he was upset about coming here because of the winters and the weather, he was not showing any of that. Obviously, the day he gets drafted, and he was just ecstatic about it and saying he loved the facilities, loved the coaches. He met with Brian Flores. They put him through some film study and all that, and they got to talking to him about where he had to grow, because this is a guy who had, I believe, just four and a half sacks through 4 years at Georgia. He was actually seldom started too. I believe he had just had 10 starts through those 4 years. And those are stacked defensive lines. So that doesn't mean that he was a bad player, but you just didn't see the realized potential in college. And the Vikings saw the film, and Kwesi called it just a unique evaluation for them, because as Kwesi says, he goes, I'm a data guy. I want to see those traits translate to production on the field. And it takes coaches to come in and say, no, we have a vision for this player of what he could potentially be. He lit up the combine. He was one of the most athletic guys in terms of his weight and size for the numbers that he put up in the agility and speed testing. So he's got the athleticism. The Vikings now, much like the former staff saw with Danielle Hunter way back when in 2015, they were not scared off by this guy's lack of production in college. And I think Kwesi called him a very intelligent guy, somebody who, when he sat down with him at the facility, kind of pointed out where he needed to grow and improve. A very self-aware guy who understood those things, which is half the battle. When you get these young college kids coming into NFL programs, much of where the shortcomings start is when they don't want to improve or don't see where they can grow themselves. And so with this guy, 139th overall pick, first defensive edition, the Vikings felt like they got a guy who could grow behind Jonathan Allen, Javon Hargrave, potentially into something more down the road.
Right. He pretty notably said he was like, I'm not coming in looking to start right away. He said, I want to learn from those guys. I know I need to get better. Which is not something you hear all the time. It's usually not one end of the spectrum like that. They usually fall somewhere in the middle, where they're like, of course I'm going to compete and I want to get out there, but I know I'm going to learn from whoever's ahead of me. So to hear him say that kind of perked my ear up of, okay, this is a guy who I think knows that he has growing to do in the league, and that the league is a step up from the collegiate level. It is not the same thing.
Yeah, and we should note too, there was an interesting connection. He went to the same high school and apparently grew up in the same neighborhood as former Vikings receiver Sidney Rice, who's a name that Vikings fans probably haven't heard in some time. But Rice obviously had 4 decent years for Minnesota before injuries kind of undercut his career. But Ingram Dawkins had mentioned that he's had many conversations with Sidney in the past. Their families are close, and he said that knowing that he's going to this organization, I believe Tyrion said what he said something like, it's about more than me, it's about our city, kind of thing. So this guy was very eager to return to the Midwest in a way that I don't see most Georgia players being.
We had another defensive pick. The Vikings did another defensive pick later in the day at 201. They drafted Penn State linebacker Kobe King. I think this was the big surprise, at least positionally for me, because linebacker is really one we didn't talk about at all in the pre-draft process. None of us put it in our little take a flyer. Who are they going to pick at a random position? It wasn't one that came up on defense. Obviously, we talked a lot about the DBs and the DTs. This is the other guy that they seem to like on special teams. That was something Kwesi brought up. But yeah, this one is probably the most interesting pick to me, I think.
Yeah, me too, because I had to go back now and just look up who was the linebacker they had added in free agency this year, and it was Eric Wilson, the former Viking undrafted signing way back when. And I guess it makes sense, because Eric is long in the tooth. He's in his 9th or 10th year already now. And so they bring in a young guy in Kobe King who could maybe develop into a special teamer behind Cashman and Pace, because Cashman and Pace, you'd think that they think they're set for the next 2 or 3 years, at least in the middle of that defense. And so with King, he comes in as a depth piece. They lost Camus Grugier Hill. I believe it would have been this past offseason, right, in free agency. And then only bring in Eric Wilson, somebody who can give you immediate impact. But King will give you that kind of developmental upside. And it was interesting to hear him talk about his twin, who just got drafted by the Packers last year, because they're both from Detroit, and then they go to two different NFC North teams now where they're going to face off against each other with the Vikings and Packers. So Emily, you did more on him for the paper and for the website, so you would know more than I do, but I just found that interesting that he's got that family connection as well.
Yeah, no, that'll be a great feature story to milk in the fall when they go out to Green Bay. One of us will have to do that. There's a lot of sibling connections or interesting sibling stories among the Vikings locker room, it feels like. But this is one to add to the list. No, what I was interested in is Kwesi talked with King about how the Vikings obviously went through a ton of pre-draft simulations and looked at different stuff. And he wasn't someone, it sounded like, had kind of made it all the way to the top rung where Kwesi and Kevin were looking at him a ton. But there was one simulation somewhere in the process where he was still available. All of this was so vague when Kwesi was telling us the story, but it was interesting. There was some simulation they did where when he came up, Kwesi went and made the point of going to look at his film because he was like, oh, I don't think this guy would still be available here. And when he looked at the film was like, oh, he's definitely not going to be available here. We don't know what pick that was going to be. The latest pick they were originally slated to have was 187. And of course, this is, I'm not going to do the math in my head, the farther back than that it was taken at 201. Yeah. So that was interesting to me. Just in terms of someone that maybe came onto their board or at least rose to a more prominent position on their board kind of later in the game than maybe some of these earlier guys that we've been talking about.
Yeah, and they moved around the board enough, as we mentioned, 3 trade backs that I'm sure they had all these ranges where they thought about guys, and then suddenly they find themselves with 2 picks in a different range at would have been the end of the 6th round. Where they found King. So yeah, he's an interesting pick and a guy that seems to be also the type of personality and culture fit that they often talk about. Also at least the second twin on the roster, including Aaron Jones. So right. Aaron's got his twin Alvin. And then actually Shaq's no longer here. Shaq Griffin is also a twin. So they only got 2, not 3.
Final edition of the draft was a tight end, so I was vindicated there in saying that they were going to take a tight end, even though I did not end up being vindicated in the DBs. But we all kind of lost that battle. We're talking about it. But they do take a tight end. They do take an ACC tight end in Pitt's Gavin Bartholomew, mullet king. ? We don't know if he still has a mullet. I was on that call, but had it muted because I was transcribing things about King that Kwesi had said. So I guess, Andrew, what did you hear from Bartholomew that was the takeaway there?
He obviously knows Brian O'Neill, who went to Pitt. He knows Jordan Addison, who went to Pitt. And the funniest thing out of that connection was Kwesi saying, you guys know Jordan Addison's not much of a talker. And I'm paraphrasing what he said, but it was something to the effect of he's not very emotional. And then you bring up Gavin, and Jordan just lit up because Jordan was still there at Pitt before transferring to USC when Gavin came in. I believe he would have been a 3-star recruit in 2021. So those guys obviously got along. Gavin is one of the other ones who developed into a team captain among the Vikings 5 draft picks. For them, he wasn't much of a receiver, but clearly they're just bringing him in as a guy who can replace maybe Johnny Munt or Nick Muse as kind of that 3rd, 4th developmental tight end. And obviously Gavin was over the moon to join the Vikings, talked about TJ Hawkinson, wanting to learn from him. Did not get to ask him about his mullet because I couldn't see whether it was still there. It just, like you said, the phone, whenever you're kind of FaceTiming with somebody and these connections are not great, some guys are getting choppy and you're not getting the full quotes and all this kind of stuff. So I didn't get to see quite the mullet, but he had it at the combine, and I honestly still hope he's got it, because if you've got him with TJ Hawkinson's flow, that's going to put Josh Oliver in a spot where he's got to grow his hair out. Otherwise, he's just not going to fit in.
Right. And maybe this is stereotyping a little bit, but a guy who rocks a mullet feels like he's probably good at barbecue, and we've maybe been beating a dead horse here, but the tight ends won the barbecue competition last year with Johnny Munt, who they now need to replace because neither Josh nor TJ wanted to cook. So maybe the rookie gets thrown into it.
Yeah, and I feel like if you're a tight end, you have to be good behind a barbecue. That's just, and when you saw the NFL draft shots too, it felt like half of the positions that had the dead animals on the wall behind them were all tight ends. I know one of them was
minus Quinn Ewers.
Yeah, thank you, Quinn Ewers. As I said, there was a quarterback too. Yeah, him as well. But otherwise, it was just offensive linemen and tight ends, and then all of their families' dead animals behind them.
Yeah. It's a good we should keep a stat tracker on that next year. Like how many prospects, what's the breakdown of prospects who have wall mounted animals? That's funny. Anyway. Now I've lost my train of thought. Oh, I was gonna add other fun facts we know about some of these guys. I saw this on Twitter earlier. Ty Felton can do a crazy backflip. So I'm actually gonna start petitioning that they flip him to cornerback. Or safety, and then have him join the dance committee.
Well, he's going to fit in with Justin Jefferson. Jefferson
that
always
too.
used, when he was in whenever they used to do victory formation early in his career, Jefferson would be in the back. This was still when Mike Zimmer was still here. And he would lay on his back after the snap, after they won. He'd lay on his back and then just kind of vault himself up onto his feet as just like a showing of his athleticism and a celebration or whatever. But since then, Kevin O'Connell must have put a stop to that. It's like, you're not going to get hurt doing a victory formation for us. So stop doing that. So yeah. Ty Felton can replace them with the emote, the celebration there at the end.
It's like it was I don't know if you've seen the video, Andrew. Maybe I'll try and get it and splice it over here. But it's not a normal front flip either. It was like he kind of like flipped to the side, but also like the air he got on it, which his vertical at the combine. Let's see if I can pull it up quickly. His vertical at the combine was also something that got talked about last night, outside of just his speed.
I did not see this video of his. You said it's a front flip. It's not even a back flip.
Yeah, I think it was like a front flip and like also to the side. I'll find it. We'll figure out a way to get it in here. But his vertical jump at the combine was 39.5 inches, which was, I think, top 5 at the draft. And you could
talk about versatility. It sounds like they actually got an X Games star as well.
This man can do everything, it seems like. So
put him on a BMX bike and see what he can do in a half bike.
Those are the Vikings draft picks. We do have some of the UDFAs confirmed. I think about 6 of them right now. The biggest one being Minnesota quarterback Max Brosmer, who's staying home. He's not from here, but he's staying in Minnesota for a little bit longer. I listened to Max when he talked at the combine. Seems like a good kid. I know at Pro Day, I don't remember where the earworm came from, but like it definitely seemed like they were looking at him. The Vikings were at his Pro Day. They at least were interested, right? I mean, all of their staff is there and watching anyway, but when he went out to throw, Kevin O'Connell was out behind him and Wes Phillips and stuff, kind of watching that happen. So I can't say this is too surprising, but I think is a good addition to put in and bring a 4th member to this QB room.
Yeah, and the Vikings clearly had to win a bidding war to get him because he reportedly signed for $250,000 guaranteed, which would have been the most among their undrafted free agents last year when it was Gabe Murphy who topped the group with $245,000. So it's not the most they've ever given out, but it's only an amount they give out if they need to keep a guy from signing somewhere else. Like this is such a high amount. That's usually a 6th, 7th round guarantee. He's getting that as an undrafted guy. And yeah, when we were at the Pro Day, his leadership, even at the combine, seeing him just stand up and speak in front of the group. But at the Pro Day, he decided to kind of call out after his throwing drills to the scouts. He walked over and said, "Hey guys, I don't know if you know all these D2 and D." He didn't say this, but he was throwing to a bunch of D2, D3 guys, kind of non-Gophers guys. Call him out and say, "Here's a guy from La Crosse. Here's a guy from Duluth, Mankato, and all this kind of stuff." And that's the kind of leadership that really wins coaches over, and seeing like this is a guy who's about things greater than himself. And I think Max was impressive, obviously, his 1 year at the U with the Gophers. But just as a person, when you get around him, it's not too much of a shock that the Vikings saw something like, hey, we could potentially get, the best version of this guy. And then even if he's just a reserve. He's going to be a guy who's good for the room and good to be around, good for a young 22-year-old J.J. McCarthy, who that's what this has all been about. It's whether it's Donovan Jackson in the first round or it's Max Brosmer in undrafted free agency. It's about getting the right people around the future franchise quarterback of the Minnesota Vikings, which obviously at this point, following the draft, now that they've got 4 quarterbacks on the roster, it's obviously always been about J.J. McCarthy.
Right. Well, and we've talked a lot about the adding veterans to support JJ, right? Which I do think you need early on in his career, but you do also need the younger guys that they're bringing in now that they potentially see as longer term guys as well, because you want your quarterback to have guys that he feels like he's grown up with in the league and has as peers, and not just kind of a rotating cast of older characters that are supporting him. Like, you want some guys that he can cling to. And now he has Jackson, like you said, who I'm sure will be a big one. He has Felton. He has, even like you say, Brosmer, and then all these other guys that I'm about to list off who are undrafted free agents as well. But I think kind of like to bring it full circle, and we were talking about at the beginning, like, what's the takeaway from this draft? It was how offensive heavy it is, but it's how offensive heavy it is in direct correlation to how they are wanting to build this team around JJ. Like, it's been a very JJ centric offseason, I think, overall.
Yeah, absolutely. And for them to not bring in really any quarterback, I mean, they wanted to keep Daniel Jones. That would have been more of the veteran guy that you think, okay, maybe he could start week 1 if JJ's not ready. But since then, there hasn't really been a guy that they've sniffed that you would really think could challenge them. Now, Kirk Cousins could have been an option had Kirk had any interest in coming here. But I believe even after the draft, we still don't know where Kirk Cousins is going. That has yet to be decided. But whether it was Ryan Tannehill, I'm trying to think, Joe Flacco, like there just wasn't a ton of options there that you're thinking like, okay, they're really serious about, making JJ McCarthy wait. Aaron Rodgers would have been the only one. And I'm really glad that we went 31 minutes into this podcast before bringing him up.
Basically 32.
But he would have been the only one. And obviously they only deliberated about that for a short while before telling Aaron, thank you, but no, thank you.
Yeah, for sure. So quarterback room seems pretty rounded for now. They've got 4 guys in there. I wouldn't expect that they would add anyone else, at least not until training camp. Maybe then they expand back to 5 like they had at their peak last year. But the Vikings did just release their list of 19 undrafted free agents they've signed so far. So I will read us through that real quick, see if there's any names that you recognize in here, Andrew, or that I recognize. Though looking at it, I don't think there is. Okay, we've got BYU outside linebacker Tyler Batty, Texas wide receiver Silas Bolden, Brosmer, as we've already said, Kansas offensive lineman Logan Brown, Georgia outside linebacker Chaz Chambliss, that's a good name, Auburn punter Oscar Chapman, who is an international player. I wonder what country he's from. It doesn't say. They got a punting competition. NC State offensive lineman.
He's got to be from Australia.
He's got to be Australia. That's where most of them are from. I feel like I've seen some. There's been more Ireland players recently, though, too. I don't know, but Australia would be my guess. NC State offensive lineman Zeke Coral, Tulane wide receiver Dante Fleming, Kansas State cornerback Keenan Garber, Wisconsin offensive lineman Joe Huber, Auburn linebacker Austin Keys, Auburn wide receiver Robert Lewis, Auburn linebacker Dorian Massey. These guys are going to have a great time in training camp all together, or in rookie mini camp all together. North Carolina tight end Bryson Nesbitt, Miami safety Michelle Powell, Jacksonville State running back Trey Stewart, Utah cornerback Zamiah Vaughn, Middle Tennessee State defensive lineman Alex Williams, and Georgia tight end Ben Urasek.
So no shocker that they brought in multiple tight ends. Really a lot of offensive players. Who were the defensive backs that they brought in?
Right. I was gonna round up here. Not many. We have two cornerbacks, a safety, 2 linebackers, 2 outside linebackers. and a defensive lineman, I think. And then pretty much all the rest are wide receivers, offensive linemen, or tight ends, plus the one running back and plus Brosmer.
Okay. Yeah, that's no shock there because they only had, I suppose, with Bartholomew, he was the third tight end on the roster, so they bring in some more there. Nesbitt's a guy that I'd heard throughout the draft process that they had some interest in as kind of a potential receiving tight end who's got some untapped potential and some upside there. Whereas Bartholomew just kind of projects as more of this maybe Josh Oliver type in terms of his ceiling if he can develop into a really good blocker. So none of those guys stood out to me in terms of just hearing their names, but we're not the scouts. What's going to tell is when you get the full list here in a week or two, or maybe less than that, of the guarantees of what they paid these guys. And that'll kind of create that natural ranking of how they feel about who they're bringing in, because that says a lot. Andre Carter, I think, got the record from the Vikings a couple years ago, is almost $350,000 guaranteed. He ends up sticking around for a couple years, showed nothing, but they kept giving him chances. Gabe Murphy makes the roster last year. He was the top guy who signed. I wouldn't be shocked if Max Brosmer ends up being the highest guarantee that they give out this year at 250, but that doesn't mean it couldn't be somebody else. So that the money that they allocate, which will come out later, will truly tell us kind of how they viewed this undrafted class in terms of who are the priorities.
We will be waiting on that. I think we're going to meet a lot of these guys at rookie mini camp in a couple weekends. I believe that's set for the second weekend in May, which would be the 9th through the 11th or the 12th. But yeah, I mean, should we give a draft grade, Andrew? Do you have a grade for how they did in this draft?
Oh boy, yeah, I love draft grades. I don't. Let's say I'm gonna give them a solid B plus.
Okay,
and that's my tepid. And I love grades because they're either A plus, and the worst you get is like a C. Like no one's ever like F. What are you doing? So I'm gonna fit right in the middle there and say a B plus. I think that the Donovan Jackson signing is not one in the first round that I saw coming. I just didn't think the value would be there on the interior offensive line. Felt like they would have had options later, but I also didn't foresee them sticking and picking and not trading back to acquire more top 100 picks. Donovan Jackson was actually the only top 100 pick that they made because Felton ends up going number 102. So they didn't want to waste it. Kwesi gave the golf analogy we talked about, just trying to hit one down the middle to get back on the fairway. And that's what they felt like they had to do. And it completed that interior offensive line group. But when they talk about the secondary and the lack of attention there, Kwesi basically just said the draft is about opportunity, and we didn't have much opportunity to strike at those spots. So clearly how their board fell, they just didn't want to go after a corner or a safety. That does not mean that everything is A-OK there. However, their corners are still Isaiah Rodgers, Byron Murphy Jr., and Mekhi Blackman. I would think those are the top three. Jeff Okudah is also in the mix, but he hasn't been much of a guy at his various stops. So the secondary is the most intriguing thing to me in terms of the holes there, what they got, and what they didn't fill in this draft. So that's the only reason I wouldn't give it an A. It just feels like that has been like kind of a glaring spot that they still need some answers.
They did make it out with one more pick than the total we thought they were going to end with, which is a win after Kwesi joked the other day. We kept on reminding him there was only 4 picks in this draft. He was like, 4? I haven't heard. They did end up with 5. So maybe for that, I'll give them the A- and just go a smidge above you. But I think that's all we have for to wrap up this draft. There's going to be more coverage, obviously, online at thestartribune.com of both draft weekend, and then as we get to go out for offseason program for the first time this week, I believe J.J. McCarthy should be talking this week. So we'll have obviously coverage of that and these other new arrivals as we get to meet them in person. But stay tuned there, and we will talk to you again on the podcast very soon.